The scandal born of a ball. The Patmore Chronicles. They say Mayfair never truly sleeps. It merely dozes with one eye open, while the other peers from behind lace curtains. For weeks now, whispers have drifted through drawing rooms and confectionaries like draughts in forbidden corridors. A woman's name spoken softly, a gentleman mentioned with excessive caution, and an encounter, my dear readers, that should never have occurred beneath the golden glow of a respectable chandelier. Panad. Tom Patmore. That morning, Mayfair awoke wrapped in its habitual air of presumptuous elegance. Carriages rolled along the street, as though parading for an invisible audience, while impeccably dressed ladies glided along the pavements with the same care they devoted to guarding their secrets. Winter still breathed a delicate chill, enough to pinken noses and justify endless cups of tea, or, for the more daring, hot chocolate. On the most fragrant corner of the neighborhood, Spencer's confectionery was already in full activity. Sugar was sifted like stardust, doughs rested beneath pristine cloths, and the scent of toasted almonds slipped beyond the doorway, beckoning the curious and the gossip-prone alike. Behind the counter stood James Spencer, a respectable confectioner and tireless observer of human nature, working with the calm of one who knew that sweets revealed more truths than hurried confessions ever could. As he delicately shaped small lemon tarts, James listened. He always listened. It was there, amid oven trays and sighs, that Mayfair let its masks fall. "They say Lady Alford refused 3 invitations to dance last night," murmured a patron, leaning over the counter as if sugar itself might overhear. "Refused? Or was she prevented?" replied another, her smile altogether too satisfied. James raised an almost imperceptible eyebrow. Lady Camille Alford. The name was beginning to surface with uncomfortable frequency. To society's eyes, Camille was everything one could elegantly overlook. The youngest daughter of a respectable baron, she possessed gentle beauty, keen intelligence, and an irritating talent for observing without being noticed. She was neither the diamond of the season nor a scandalous figure. She was discreet. And in Mayfair, discretion was often mistaken for insignificance. That very afternoon, Camille prepared for the Countess of Harrington's winter ball, an event whose importance lay less in the music than in the glances exchanged in the shadows of columns. Before the mirror, she adjusted her gloves with steady hands, though her heart insisted on beating with a nervousness she could not fully justify. "Do not expect too much of this evening, my dear," said her elder sister, adjusting her hair. "Balls rarely reserve pleasant surprises for those who are not seeking them." Camille smiled, a gentle, almost resigned smile. Little did she know that surprises that night would find her uninvited. The Countess's ballroom gleamed like a newly polished jewel. Chandeliers cast golden reflections over silks and jewels, while the orchestra rehearsed chords that promised long waltzes and perilous conversations. Camille entered with her family, her steps measured, her gaze attentive. It was how she survived, by observing, and then she saw him. Lord Giorgio required no announcement of his presence. He imposed it. Tall, impeccably poised, his expression controlled like a well-guarded secret. He was respected, desired, and above all wrapped in an aura of mystery that fed ceaseless speculation. Newly arrived from Scotland, he carried with him rumors of complicated inheritances, somber estates, and a past conveniently left undiscussed. Camille's eyes met his for a brief instant, long enough for something silent and irrevocable to take hold between them. At that same hour, James Spencer crossed the ballroom bearing a tray of sweets commissioned especially for the ball. It was not uncommon for his creations to appear at the most select events. After all, sugar opened doors that titles could not, and, as always, he observed. "Look," someone whispered near him. "Bergman has arrived." James followed the murmur to the center of the room and noted with sharpened curiosity the precise moment Bergman's gaze drifted from the hostess to settle upon Camille Alford. A detail too small for most. Never for him. The night advanced in dance steps and raised glasses. Camille politely declined 2 invitations, preferring to remain near the columns, where she could breathe without being examined like merchandise. It was there that Bergman approached. "Lady Alford," he said, inclining his head slightly, "would you permit me this dance?" The request, simple in form, carried an unexpected weight. Around them, eyes sharpened. Camille felt warmth rise to her cheeks, but she nodded. The dance was different. There was no haste, no display, only low, nearly intimate conversation carried between measured steps. "You do not often dance?" he asked. "I tend to observe," she replied, with disarming honesty. A rare skill and a dangerous one. Something in his tone made her stomach turn. At the music's end, Bergman guided her toward a less illuminated corner, where words seemed less closely watched. It was there that the mistake occurred, a gesture misread, a moment prolonged too long, a look that someone inevitably chose to observe with excessive attention. "Are they alone?" whispered a lady behind her fan. "Far too close, I would say." As he gathered empty plates, James Spencer sensed the shift in the air. Mayfair knew when to sniff out a scandal, and like any good chronicler, he recorded every detail in his mind. Soon after, Camille was urgently summoned by her mother. The Baroness's pale expression suggested that something was already travelling faster than the music. "There have been remarks," the Baroness murmured. "We must leave." Bergman watched Camille walk away, unable to utter a single word. For the first time that night, his impeccable expression faltered. The following morning, Mayfair awoke hungry. At Spencer's confectionery, the buzz was more intense than usual. James served tea while absorbing fragments of conflicting versions. They say they were seen in a dark corner. They say he compromised her. They say she planned it all. James wiped his hands on his apron and later sat at the small desk at the back of the shop. The quill glided with ease. There were stories that demanded to be told. The Patmore Chronicles. Ah, my attentive readers. When two destinies cross beneath the imprudent light of a ballroom, it is not merely steps that entwine, but entire reputations. Lady Camille Alford, until then as discreet as a sigh, suddenly found herself at the centre of indecorous murmurs. And Lord Bergman, newly arrived from the Scottish mists, may have brought with him more than trunks and titles. I wonder, who will be observing whom now? Tom Patmore Camille, in her silent chamber, stared at the ceiling as though answers might be found in the shadows. Something had begun, something that could not be undone, and Mayfair, as ever, awaited the next chapter. Tom Patmore. The Patmore Chronicles. There are silences that cry out louder than well-spread rumours. Since the infamous winter ball, Mayfair has pretended to resume its routine, yet everyone knows this truth. When a young woman begins to be watched with excessive attention, it is because something has already been decided by others. Lady Camille Alford has ceased to be invisible, and my dear readers, that rarely happens without cost. Signed, Tom Patmore. The days that followed the ball were marked by an artificial quiet. Camille noticed it during her very first morning visit, when she entered her aunt's tea room and felt eyes settle upon her with newly awakened interest. There were no direct accusations nor explicit remarks, only that particular kind of attention that carried enough judgment to weigh upon one's shoulders. She maintained her impeccable composure. It was, after all, what was expected of a well-bred young lady. Even so, something within her had changed. The encounter with Lord Giorgio Bergman, as brief as it was laden with meaning, insisted on occupying her thoughts at the most inconvenient moments. While adjusting her gloves, while turning pages of a book without absorbing the words, while watching steam rise from a teacup. Mayfair, meanwhile, amused itself. At Spencer's confectionery, James Spencer served sweets with precision, while absorbing, as always, the city's echoes. The tables were filled with ladies who pretended to discuss recipes, but were in truth feeding on conjecture. "They say Lord Bergman did not return to Scotland as planned," remarked one. "And they say he has been seen with excessive frequency in Mayfair," added another. James said nothing. He merely observed, attentive. He knew how to recognize when a story began to take on a life of its own. Camille returned to the confectionery only days later, accompanied by her younger cousin. She needed something sweet, not for her palate but for her nerves. As she crossed the threshold, she felt inexplicably lighter. The familiar scent had that effect. "Lady Alford," James greeted her with a slight nod. "How may I serve you today?" "Something simple," she replied after a brief pause. "Perhaps something that does not draw attention." James smiled discreetly. There was irony enough in that choice to entertain his quill later. It was there, between one careful bite and the next, that Camille heard the sound of familiar footsteps. She did not need to turn to recognize the presence. "Lady Alford," Bergman's voice was as controlled as it had been at the ball, yet there was in it a new tension, almost imperceptible. Camille lifted her eyes. He stood closer than prudence would advise. "Lord Bergman," she replied, keeping her tone neutral. Behind the counter, James pretended to align sweets that were already perfectly arranged. "I did not know you frequented this establishment," Bergman continued. "I frequent places where I feel at ease," she answered with sincerity. The silence that followed was dense, not uncomfortable but heavy with unspoken words. "I regret," he said at last, "what occurred that night." "Regret does not undo rumors," she replied without sharpness. "It only feeds them." He inclined his head, accepting the blow with elegance. "May I accompany you on a brief walk?" he ventured. It was a simple request, but nothing at that moment was simple. Even so, Camille nodded. They walked through the streets of Mayfair with careful steps, maintaining the precise distance society would deem acceptable. They spoke of trivialities, the weather, newly published books, the differences between London and the Scottish Highlands. Yet beneath every word something pulsed, restless. "Scotland is more honest," he remarked. "Silence there carries less judgment." "Here, even silence observes," she replied. He smiled, a brief, almost melancholic smile. From that day on, the meetings grew more frequent, never announced, always too fortuitous to be coincidence. A stroll in the park, a brief conversation after a social event, a lingering glance during a formal dinner, and Mayfair noticed the Patmore Chronicles. How curious it is that a city becomes a stage when two hearts rehearse forbidden steps. Lord Bergman and Lady Alford announce no intentions, yet their eyes do so for them. I wonder, is it prudence or fear that keeps them at a distance? Signed, Tom Patmore. Camille felt divided. Each meeting brought her a restrained joy, followed almost immediately by guilt. She knew her reputation had already been lightly bruised, something that, for a young woman in her position, was more dangerous than it seemed. Bergman, in turn, carried the weight of silent expectations. He had returned to London with clear purposes, none of which included emotional entanglement. Yet each time he saw Camille, he felt his certainties slip through his fingers. It was during a dinner at the home of acquaintances that the tension reached a new level. Seated at opposite ends of the table, they exchanged only occasional glances. But a single malicious remark, delivered with feigned innocence, was enough to alter the course of the evening. "Lady Alford seems quite sought after of late," said a lady, her smile far too thin. Camille felt heat rise to her face. Bergman, without thinking, intervened. "I do not believe that is an appropriate subject for the table," he said firmly. The silence that followed was deafening. Later, in the garden, he approached her. "Forgive me," he said. "I did not intend to place you in an even more delicate position." "Perhaps it is already too late for that," she replied with a restrained sigh. "Mayfair has already decided to observe." He hesitated, then spoke in a low voice. "If I were to tell you there are reasons why I must be cautious, would you believe me?" She looked at him, surprised. "We all have reasons," she said. "What matters is what we do despite them." That night something broke. There were no declarations, no promises. Only the clear awareness that they were walking along an ever more tenuous line. James Spencer, upon hearing fragments of that exchange the following day, brought to him by an excessively well-informed client, knew the story was nearing a dangerous point. And like every good chronicler, he prepared himself. The Patmore Chronicles. When the heart decides to speak louder, reason tends to whisper its warnings far too late. Lady Alford and Lord Bergman now tread unstable ground, where each step may be read as confession. I wonder, which of them will fall first, or both? The serial comes to an end, not with answers, but with a question suspended in the air. And Mayfair, as always, waits. Signed, Tom Patmore. The following day, new installments of the gossip serial, the Patmore Chronicles. There comes a moment, dear readers, when even the best-kept secrets grow weary of the dark. Mayfair now lives in this restlessness. When glances turn into silent accusations and smiles into sharpened weapons, only one choice remains: to remain silent forever, or to speak once and for all. Signed, Tom Patmore. The final rumor spread like fire across dry paper. Camille heard it first at home, carried by a maid far too nervous to disguise her curiosity. Later, she confirmed it in her mother's eyes, which no longer attempted to soften their concern. "They say," the Baroness began, her voice low, "that Lord Bergman hides something that would make any connection to him profoundly inconvenient." Camille felt her heart tighten. The comment soon gained clearer contours. It was whispered that Giorgio Bergman bore a tainted inheritance, a threatened title. An old promise made in Scotland, involving lands, honor, and a forgotten fiancé. None of this had been told to her, and yet all of it settled upon her shoulders. At Spencer's confectionery, the atmosphere was one of nervous anticipation. James Spencer sensed it in the way customers spoke more quickly, as though they feared the scandal might dissipate, if not repeated aloud. "They say he is not free," remarked one lady, nibbling a sweet with an air of triumph. "They say Lady Alford was imprudent," replied another. James closed his eyes for a brief instant. That story demanded truth. Camille decided she would wait no longer. If there was something she needed to know, she would hear it from the only person who could answer. They met at dusk, far from the drawing rooms, in a small, little-frequented garden. The sky threatened rain, as if sharing the tension of the moment. "I need you to be honest with me," she said without preamble. "Is there something I do not know?" Bergman remained silent for an instant too long. "There is," he answered at last. He then told her of the contested inheritance, of an old promise made under circumstances that no longer existed, of the weight of expectations he had not chosen to bear. There was no other woman waiting for him, only a past that society preferred to turn into a convenient scandal. "I did not wish to involve you," he concluded, "but I failed." Camille felt the pain of omission, but also something deeper: understanding. "Mayfair adores incomplete stories," she said gently, "and it punishes those who do not defend themselves." The scandal erupted on the night of the season's closing ball, as though it had been waiting for a proper stage. Eyes turned, whispers ceased when Camille and Bergman entered the ballroom together. James Spencer watched from a discreet corner, arms crossed, attentive to every reaction. It was Bergman who spoke first, his voice clear enough to reach the most attentive. "There are things I must clarify." Silence fell absolute. He explained with dignity and firmness, dismantling rumor after rumor. He spoke of honor, of choices, of responsibility. And finally he turned to Camille. "And as for Lady Alford," he said, drawing a breath, "nothing that has been said diminishes the respect I hold for her." The risk was immense. Both their reputations were at stake. Then Camille stepped forward. "I do not regret having been seen," she said, her voice steady. "I would regret only having allowed others to define my story. It was enough." Society surprisingly yielded, not out of kindness, but because courage always unsettles more than scandal. Days later the announcement was made, a discreet yet undeniable engagement. Mayfair, both affronted and fascinated, accepted it. At Spencer's confectionery, James prepared the largest order he had ever received, sweets for an engagement that had begun as rumor. And that night, he sat at his desk one last time for this story. The Patmore Chronicles. And so, dear readers, when truth decides to dance at the center of the ballroom, even the most avid gossips are forced to applaud. Lady Camille Alford is no longer invisible, and Lord Bergman has proved that not every mystery conceals dishonor. Let this story serve as a warning. Underestimate a quiet heart at your own risk. Signed, Tom Patmore. The wedding was celebrated weeks later between London and the Scottish hills. There was music, laughter, and above all, peace. Camille, now mistress of her own story, smiled as she realized that love, when true, required no approval, only courage. Bergman, at her side, seemed finally free. James Spencer observed it all from a distance, satisfied. There were stories that deserved happy endings, and Mayfair would always ask for more. Signed, Tom Patmore.